The bus station in Culiacán pulsed with the chaotic energy of hundreds of people beginning journeys they hoped would change their lives, and Carlos Mendoza stood among them, clutching a canvas bag containing 3 changes of clothes, his mother's photograph, and 800 pesos that represented her life savings. At 23 years old, he stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, with the lean build of someone whose body had been shaped by agricultural labor rather than adequate nutrition, possessing the unremarkable appearance that would later prove his greatest asset and his deepest curse. His mother, Rosa, had accompanied him to the station despite his protests that she should rest her failing knees rather than walk the 3 kilometers from their home. She gripped his arm with surprising strength for a woman whose 62 years had been spent in fields where the sun and labor-aged people twice as fast as it should. Her face showed every one of those hard years, deep lines carved around her eyes and mouth, skin darkened and weathered from decades outdoors. But her eyes held a hope that Carlos found almost unbearable, because he understood how completely his success or failure would define her remaining years. The promise Carlos made to his mother that humid September morning in 1989 was specific and spoken with the absolute certainty of young men who have not yet learned how easily the world destroys careful plans. He told her he would work construction in Texas, where wages were 10 times what he could earn in Sinaloa, that he would live cheaply and save aggressively, and that in exactly 2 years he would return with enough money to build her a concrete blockhouse with a real roof to replace the corrugated metal sheets that leaked during every rain. He promised her indoor plumbing so she would never again haul water from the communal well, electricity so she could have a refrigerator and television, and enough savings that she could stop working the chili fields that were destroying her body. 2 years seemed reasonable, achievable, and specific enough to be believable. Rosa's tears as she blessed him were not the tears of a mother who doubted her son would try to fulfill his promise, but of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the world cared nothing for the promises of poor people, and that forces far beyond individual control determined whether good intentions produced good outcomes. Carlos had chosen Texas rather than California because he had a distant cousin, Hector, who had been working Houston construction for 5 years and had promised to help him find work and housing. The journey north would take him through Mexico City, where he would meet a coyote who specialized in Texas crossings, then across the border near Laredo, and finally to Houston, where Hector worked for a company that built commercial warehouses and needed laborers willing to work hard for modest wages. The plan was straightforward, and thousands of others had followed similar paths successfully, transforming themselves from struggling Mexican workers into immigrants who sent money home and eventually returned with savings that allowed them to live comfortably. Carlos understood the risks involved in illegal border crossing, the possibility of robbery by bandits, exploitation by coyotes, detention by immigration authorities, and the general precariousness of existing in a country where he would have no legal protections. But these risks seemed manageable compared to the certainty of remaining in Sinaloa, where agricultural work paid so little that he could never save enough to transform his mother's life or build any kind of future for himself. What Carlos did not understand during that optimistic bus ride north was how completely the drug trade had infiltrated every aspect of life along the migration routes he would travel, transforming what had once been straightforward journeys into opportunities for criminal organizations to identify and recruit vulnerable people who needed their operations to remain invisible. The coyote he met in Mexico City worked not as an independent businessman, but as a contractor for organizations that controlled border crossing routes and extracted maximum value from every person who used them. The warehouse where Hector helped him find work in Houston was owned by a company that existed primarily to launder money from narcotics sales, employing legitimate workers like Carlos to maintain appearances, while its real function involved moving cash through fake construction contracts. The cheap apartment complex where most Mexican workers lived was monitored by cartel associates who tracked who arrived, who sent money home, and who might be useful for purposes beyond construction labor. Carlos walked into this invisible network believing he was simply an immigrant seeking honest work, unaware that every step of his journey was observed and that his unremarkable appearance and desperate need for success made him exactly the kind of person criminal organizations found most valuable. The first 3 months of Carlos's Houston life followed the pattern he had expected and hoped for, validating his decision to leave Mexico and suggesting that his promise to his mother would be fulfilled without extraordinary difficulty. Hector had arranged a position for him with the warehouse construction company where Carlos worked 10-hour days, doing physically demanding labor that was nonetheless easier than agricultural work because it paid better and offered protection from the brutal sun. He earned $6 per hour, extraordinarily high by Mexican standards, and he lived so cheaply that he could save over half his earnings, despite having to pay rent and food costs that seemed expensive. He shared a 1-bedroom apartment with Hector and 2 other workers, sleeping on a mattress on the living room floor and eating simple meals they cooked collectively. He sent $200 to his mother every 2 weeks, money that allowed her to reduce her fieldwork and that generated letters from her expressing gratitude and pride that made him weep when he read them alone. His calculations suggested that maintaining this pattern for 2 years would indeed generate the savings needed to fulfill his promises. The murder Carlos witnessed happened on a Friday evening in December 1989, as he cut through the warehouse district, taking a shortcut home from a job site where his crew had worked overtime. He turned a corner behind a loading dock and saw 3 men surrounding a 4th who was on his knees with his hands bound behind his back and a cloth gag in his mouth. The kneeling man's face showed the swelling and cuts of someone who had been beaten extensively, and his eyes held the terror of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. Carlos froze for perhaps 2 seconds before his brain processed the scene, and his survival instinct screamed at him to run, but 2 seconds was far too long because the 3 men had already seen him. One of them, a heavy man in his 40s wearing expensive clothes that seemed incongruous in the warehouse district, pointed directly at Carlos and said something to his companions. The execution proceeded anyway with a casualness that was more terrifying than rage would have been. 2 bullets to the head of the kneeling man, who collapsed sideways onto the concrete while Carlos stood paralyzed 20 feet away. The aftermath of witnessing the execution unfolded with a speed that gave Carlos no opportunity to think or plan, only to react to immediate threats in ways that foreclosed options with finality he would not understand until much later. The heavy man approached Carlos speaking English that Carlos barely understood, asking questions whose meaning he could not grasp through the terror that made thinking almost impossible. When Carlos responded in Spanish explaining he spoke no English, the man switched languages and his questions became clear and terrifying. What had Carlos seen? Where did he work? Where did he live? Who knew he was here? Carlos understood instinctively that honesty was his only option because these men would easily discover any lie. So he admitted everything. He had seen the killing, he worked construction nearby, he lived in the immigrant apartment 6 blocks away. Nobody knew where he was because he was simply walking home from work. The heavy man studied Carlos with an expression that suggested he was calculating some complex equation where Carlos's life was one variable among many. Then he said something that Carlos would replay in his memory thousands of times, analyzing every word for meanings he had missed in the moment of overwhelming fear. The proposition the heavy man offered, Carlos was framed as a choice, but was actually an ultimatum whose options were cooperation or immediate death. And Carlos understood this even through his panic. The man explained that Carlos had witnessed something he should not have seen, that this created a problem requiring a solution, and that two solutions were possible. The first solution was permanent and would be implemented immediately. Carlos would join the dead man on the ground, and his body would disappear into the industrial waste system where dozens of others had vanished. The second solution required Carlos to work for the organization, using his unremarkable appearance and immigrant status to move money and occasionally packages between locations that would be specified. He would be paid generously for this work. He would continue his construction job as cover, and he would never speak about what he had seen or what he was doing if he performed well and caused no problems. He could eventually leave this arrangement with his life and his savings. If he tried to run or spoke to authorities or failed in his assignments, he and everyone he cared about in both Mexico and the United States would be killed in ways that would serve as warnings to others. The choice was simple: die immediately or work for them. Carlos's decision to accept the second option was not really a decision but an animal survival response. The same instinct that makes drowning people grasp at anything that might keep them alive, even when rational analysis would suggest the grasping is futile. He agreed to work for them because the alternative was death in the next 60 seconds, and some primitive part of his brain insisted that being alive created possibilities that being dead eliminated forever. He did not think about consequences or long-term implications because he was not capable of complex thought in that moment of existential terror. He simply said yes to the heavy man who introduced himself as Rogelio and who explained that Carlos would receive specific instructions soon. Then Rogelio and his companions loaded the dead man's body into a van, cleaned the blood from the concrete with chemicals they clearly carried for this purpose, and drove away, leaving Carlos standing alone behind the loading dock, trying to process what had just happened and what he had agreed to. The entire encounter, from the moment he turned the corner until he stood alone again, had lasted less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes had transformed his life completely. The practical reality of working as a money courier for a drug trafficking organization proved less dramatically dangerous than Carlos had feared during his initial terror, but more corrosive to his sense of self than he could have imagined before experiencing it. His first assignment came 3 days after the murder, when a man he had never seen before approached him at his construction job and handed him a backpack containing $140,000 in cash, bundled in plastic. The instructions were simple. Take the backpack to a specific address in a Houston suburb, ask for someone named Miguel, hand him the backpack, receive a receipt, and return to work. Carlos would be paid $500 for this delivery, an amount equal to 2 weeks of construction wages for perhaps 90 minutes of work. The delivery proceeded exactly as described with no complications or threats, and Carlos received his payment the following day from someone who approached him at the construction site. The ease of the operation and the enormous payment made Carlos understand why people got pulled into this work and why organizations found abundant recruits. The money was transformative, and the actual risk during any single operation was relatively low. The pattern established by that first delivery repeated with increasing frequency over the following months, as Carlos proved himself reliable and unremarkable, exactly the kind of courier organizations valued most. He made deliveries twice weekly on average, usually moving cash but occasionally transporting packages whose contents he never examined because he understood that certain knowledge made him more vulnerable. He continued his construction work to maintain his cover, and because organizations insisted their couriers maintain legitimate employment that explained their presence and provided plausible stories. He continued living in the cheap apartment with Hector and the other workers, never revealing his secondary income or the source of the increasing amounts of money he sent to his mother. His construction co-workers saw him as simply another immigrant worker grinding away, unaware that he was earning more from his twice-weekly deliveries than from his 40-hour construction weeks. By the summer of 1990, 9 months after arriving in Houston, Carlos had saved over $30,000 and was sending his mother $500 monthly, far more than his construction wages alone could support. The internal conflict Carlos experienced during this period was profound and corrosive, eating away at his sense of identity and moral foundation, even as his bank account grew with satisfying speed. He had come to the United States imagining himself as an honest worker who would succeed through labor and discipline, and instead he had become exactly the kind of person his mother had warned him about, someone involved with drugs and crime. He tried to rationalize his situation by noting that he personally never touched drugs, that he was only moving money and was not responsible for the violence and addiction the money represented. He told himself this was temporary, that he would work for the organization only until he had saved enough money to fulfill his promises, and then he would extract himself and return to legitimate life. These rationalizations provided minimal comfort because Carlos was intelligent enough to recognize them as self-serving lies. He knew that every dollar he saved was stained with blood, that his complicity in the drug trade contributed to destruction he could not see, but that was nonetheless real, and that he was betraying his mother's expectations even as he exceeded her financial hopes. The discovery that transformed Carlos's guilt into existential despair happened almost exactly 1 year after his arrival in Houston, when casual conversation with Rogelio revealed that the organization Carlos worked for was the Sinaloa cartel, the same organization that controlled the region where his mother lived. Rogelio mentioned this while giving Carlos instructions for a larger delivery, noting that Carlos should feel proud to work for the most professional organization in the business, one that controlled territories throughout Mexico, including their shared home state. He said this as if it were a positive connection, apparently believing that Carlos would feel some ethnic or regional pride in the organization's success. Instead, Carlos felt a horror that made him physically nauseous as he understood the full implications of what he had been doing. The money he was helping to move was generated by the same organization that terrorized Sinaloa, that corrupted local officials, that recruited and discarded young men like him as disposable assets. More importantly, working for the Sinaloa cartel meant that he could never safely return home because the organization operated there and would expect him to continue working for them if he returned, or would view his departure as potential betrayal requiring elimination. The realization that he could never go home unfolded over days and weeks as Carlos thought through every scenario and found each one led to outcomes ranging from terrible to catastrophic. If he returned to Sinaloa while still working for the cartel, they would expect him to continue his role there, probably recruiting others and expanding their courier network. Refusing would mark him as disloyal and dangerous, resulting in execution that would send a message to others. If he tried to leave the organization and return as a civilian with his savings, they would view him as a security risk who knew too much about their operations, and they would kill him and possibly his mother to ensure his knowledge did not reach authorities. If he simply ran to another part of Mexico or disappeared entirely, they would track him down because organizations invested significant resources in finding people who tried to leave, making examples of them to deter others from attempting departure. If he stayed in the United States and simply never returned home, He would avoid immediate danger but would condemn himself to permanent exile from his mother, never able to keep his promise of returning rich, forced instead to remain indefinitely in a country where he would always be illegal, vulnerable, and alone. The torture of understanding his situation was intensified by the fact that he had indeed become rich by the standards he had promised his mother, possessing savings that would allow him to build her a house far better than anything he had imagined in his optimistic promises. By early 1991, 2 years after leaving Mexico, Carlos had accumulated over $60,000, enough to build his mother a substantial home, install all the amenities he had promised, and provide her with financial security for her remaining years. He had fulfilled the financial aspect of his promise far more successfully than most immigrants could ever hope, but he could not return to deliver this wealth in person without putting both himself and his mother at catastrophic risk. The cruel irony of his situation was that his success had been purchased with his ability to enjoy that success or share it with the person who mattered most. He had promised to return rich in 2 years, and he had indeed become rich, but the source of his wealth had poisoned his ability to return. The decision Carlos made about how to handle his impossible situation reflected both his love for his mother and his understanding that he had forfeited his right to be with her through choices that could not be unmade. He continued sending her money, increasing the amounts to levels that seemed almost absurd. $1,000 monthly that allowed her to stop working entirely, move to a better house in town, and live comfortably. He wrote letters every week, carefully crafted to sound optimistic and to explain his extended absence through increasingly elaborate lies about construction opportunities that were too valuable to abandon. He claimed his boss valued him so highly that leaving would mean sacrificing career advancement that would benefit them both long-term. He promised he would visit soon, always soon, never admitting that soon meant never. His mother's letters in response showed both pride in his success and hurt at his continued absence that she tried to hide behind cheerful updates about her improved life. She wrote about the new house she had rented with his money, about neighbors who were amazed at her good fortune, about her prayers for his safety and eventual return. The years from 1991 through 1995 saw Carlos evolve from reluctant courier into a senior operative within the cartel's Houston network, a progression that happened almost involuntarily as his competence and reliability made him valuable in ways that increased both his income and his inability to ever leave. He was promoted from simple courier to someone who managed other couriers, recruiting reliable people from the immigrant community and training them in the practices that minimized risk. He coordinated deliveries across the southern United States, moving amounts that escalated from thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. He attended meetings with cartel leadership, visiting from Mexico, providing intelligence about law enforcement activities and operational challenges. Most significantly, he became someone who knew too much about too many operations to ever be allowed to simply walk away, even if he somehow managed to pay off whatever debt the organization believed he owed. His initial terror had transformed into a kind of numb competence as he performed his role with professional excellence while emotionally disconnecting from what he was actually doing. The financial rewards of Carlos's expanding role were substantial enough that money stopped being a relevant constraint on anything he might want to do, though this abundance only highlighted the emptiness of success without the ability to share it meaningfully. By 1990, he had accumulated over $300,000 in accounts, distributed across multiple locations, wealth that would have made him genuinely rich, even by American standards. He maintained his modest lifestyle and construction job cover, but occasionally indulged in purchases that suggested his hidden affluence: a reliable car, better apartment, clothes that were understated but expensive. He continued sending his mother large amounts monthly, enough that she had been able to purchase a small house and live with genuine comfort. But the money felt increasingly meaningless as the years of absence stretched into a permanent condition, and as Carlos watched his mother age through photographs without being able to touch her hand or see her smile. He had achieved wealth beyond his promises, but lost the only thing that made wealth valuable, which was sharing it with someone who loved him, regardless of whether he was rich or poor. The closest Carlos came to attempting return happened in 1990s when his mother suffered a serious health crisis and wrote him letters describing her heart problems and asking if he might visit because she feared dying without seeing him again. The desperation in her letters nearly broke his resolve to stay away, and he actually made plans to travel to Sinaloa using false documents that the cartel could provide. But Rogelio, who had become something like a friend despite their fundamentally coercive relationship, explained with genuine concern why traveling to Sinaloa would be catastrophic for both Carlos and his mother. The cartel would interpret his return as intention to resume operations there or as potential defection, and they would monitor him constantly. Any attempt to simply visit his mother and leave would be viewed as suspicious and could result in her being questioned about his activities, exposing her to dangers she had no knowledge of or protection against. Most directly, Rogelio said that if Carlos returned to Sinaloa, the organization would expect him to work there permanently, and refusing that expectation was not survivable. The message was clear. Staying away from his mother was the only way to protect her, and his love for her required accepting permanent separation. The psychological toll of Carlos's permanent exile manifested in ways that wealth could not address, and that he learned to hide behind a facade of functionality that fooled everyone except himself. He suffered from insomnia that left him exhausted but unable to rest. His mind replaying scenarios of what might have been if he had made different choices or if circumstances had been less cruel. He developed anxiety that manifested as hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats and unable to relax, even in moments that should have been safe. He self-medicated with alcohol that he consumed alone in his apartment, drinking until he could finally sleep without dreaming about his mother's face or the murder he had witnessed that started everything. He maintained no close relationships because intimacy required trust and honesty that were impossible for someone living his duplicitous life, and because he understood that anyone who got close to him became vulnerable to the violence that surrounded his existence. He functioned professionally and appeared normal to casual observers, but internally he was hollowed out by guilt, grief, and the knowledge that he had traded his soul for wealth he could not truly enjoy. The correspondence between Carlos and his mother continued through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, a relationship maintained entirely through letters and occasional phone calls that were affectionate but built on foundations of deception. Carlos's lies about why he could not visit became more elaborate and less believable over time, but his mother pretended to accept them because the alternative was acknowledging that something terrible had happened to her son or that he had chosen something else over returning to her. She wrote about her health problems, her loneliness, her neighbors and their families, filling pages with details about a life he could not share, but that she wanted him to know about. She always ended her letters with variations of the same plea. Please visit when you can. I miss you more than you can know. I want to see your face before I die. Carlos's responses were upbeat and filled with news about his imaginary construction career, stories about friends and social life that did not exist, promises that he would visit very soon that they both knew were lies. He sent her photographs of himself that showed material success, but could not convey the emptiness behind his forced smiles. The transformation of drug trafficking dynamics during the early 2000s created pressures that made Carlos's already dangerous position more precarious and further eliminated whatever slim possibility remained that he might someday escape his situation. The Mexican government's confrontation with cartels intensified violence throughout the country and disrupted established operations, forcing organizations to adapt strategies and eliminate people deemed risky or expendable. The Sinaloa cartel's war with rival organizations produced casualty rates that shocked even people familiar with drug violence, and the resulting instability made everyone involved more paranoid and more willing to eliminate potential threats preemptively. Internal cartel purges targeted people suspected of cooperating with authorities or whose loyalty was questioned for any reason, and Carlos watched several people he knew disappear, their bodies sometimes found as warnings to others. His own survival depended on being absolutely reliable, never giving any reason for doubt about his loyalty, and accepting whatever increased responsibilities the organization demanded regardless of his private feelings. Carlos's mother died in 2008 at age 81, passing away in her sleep from heart failure that had been deteriorating for years despite the excellent medical care Carlos's money had purchased. He learned of her death from his cousin Hector, who had maintained contact with family in Sinaloa, and the news arrived by phone call that Carlos received while sitting in Houston traffic on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. The grief that hit him was not the sharp shock of unexpected loss, but the crushing weight of loss that had been anticipated and feared for years, made worse by the knowledge that his last chance to see her had been permanently foreclosed by his absence. He could not attend her funeral without exposing himself to dangers that remained lethal despite the years that had passed. He could not grieve publicly or share his loss with anyone who understood the relationship's significance. He could not even visit her grave without potentially triggering surveillance or questions that would put others at risk. His mother had died without seeing him for 19 years, and he would never be able to tell her the truth about why he had stayed away or apologize for the pain his absence had caused her. The funeral arrangements Carlos made from Houston demonstrated both the resources his criminal success had provided and the fundamental inadequacy of money to address what actually mattered. He arranged and paid for an elaborate service that was far grander than anything his mother would have wanted, a way of expressing through excess what he could not express through presence. He commissioned a substantial headstone and paid for perpetual maintenance of her grave in the town cemetery. He established a fund at the local church in her name that would support poor families, knowing she would have valued that charitable legacy. He arranged for flowers to be placed on her grave weekly, indefinitely, a gesture that was simultaneously meaningful and completely insufficient. These expenditures were easy because he had far more money than he could ever use, but they could not compensate for 19 years of absence or provide the one thing his mother had actually wanted, which was to see her son before she died. The profound failure of his life was not that he had failed to become rich, as he had promised, but that his path to wealth had made him unable to share that wealth with the person he had promised to help. The years following his mother's death saw Carlos continue his criminal career, not because he still hoped to eventually escape, but because he understood that his choices had been made long ago and that the consequences were permanent and inescapable. He remained valuable to the cartel and was well compensated for his continued service, accumulating wealth that had lost whatever meaning it once possessed, but that he continued pursuing from habit and lack of alternatives. He maintained his cover life and his criminal operations with professional competence that was no longer motivated by fear or ambition, but simply by the momentum of routines established over decades. He had been in the United States for over 20 years, longer than he had lived in Mexico, and had become someone who belonged fully to neither country. His life had assumed a strange stability built on foundations of permanent exile, irreversible choices, and the understanding that some mistakes cannot be corrected, only endured. The partial redemption Carlos attempted came through efforts to help other immigrants avoid the fate that had consumed him, though he recognized that these efforts could never balance the damage his criminal career had contributed to. He identified immigrants who were being recruited by the cartel and warned them when possible about the long-term consequences of accepting what seemed like easy money. He helped people find legitimate employment alternatives that paid adequately, if not luxuriously, connecting them with employers who would hire without documentation. He anonymously funded programs that provided services to immigrant communities, including legal assistance that helped people navigate their vulnerable status without resorting to criminal work. These efforts were limited by his need to maintain his own cover, and by the reality that most people facing the choices he had faced made the same decisions because immediate survival outweighed abstract future consequences. But he persisted in these small redemptive actions because they provided the only meaning his life still held. The possibility of genuine escape from his criminal career appeared briefly in 2015 when federal prosecutors offered Carlos immunity in exchange for testimony against cartel leadership they were targeting for prosecution. The offer came after years of investigation that had identified Carlos as someone with extensive knowledge of operations and as someone whose personal history suggested he might be willing to cooperate if offered protection for himself and any family he had. The prosecutors painted an appealing picture: witness protection program, new identity, freedom from the criminal life that had consumed him, chance to finally be done with the organization that had held him for over 25 years. The offer was generous and the prosecutors seemed genuinely committed to his protection. But Carlos declined after several days of consideration, explaining to the frustrated prosecutors that he had no family to protect, that he did not believe any protection program could truly keep him safe from an organization as capable as the Sinaloa cartel, and that he had made his choices long ago and would live with them rather than becoming a traitor who endangered everyone he had ever worked with. The truth he did not tell them was that accepting their offer felt like a final betrayal of his mother's memory, a confirmation that her son had become exactly the kind of person she had prayed he would never be. Carlos continued working for the cartel through the late 2010s and into the 2020s, becoming one of the organization's longest-serving and most reliable operatives in the United States, though this longevity was more curse than achievement. By 2020, he had been involved with the organization for over 30 years, longer than many cartel members survived, and had accumulated wealth exceeding $2 million that he had no meaningful way to spend. He was 54 years old, physically healthy but psychologically exhausted, going through motions of a life that had long since lost whatever purpose or meaning it had once possessed. He maintained his modest lifestyle despite his wealth because extravagance attracted attention, and because material possessions had proven unable to provide the satisfaction he had once imagined wealth would bring. His apartment contained little beyond basic furniture and books. His car was reliable but unremarkable, and his only indulgence was sending anonymous donations to charitable organizations in both Mexico and the United States. The final recognition Carlos reached about his life and choices came not through some dramatic revelation, but through gradual acceptance that accumulated over years of reflection about paths not taken and consequences that could not be escaped. He understood that he had made a choice in that warehouse district in 1989 Not the choice to work for the cartel, which was not really a choice at all, but the earlier choice to cut through that particular alley at that particular moment, the random decision that had put him in a position where all subsequent options were terrible. He understood that his real mistake had been believing that he could control outcomes through effort and planning, when in reality life turned on random moments that foreclosed entire futures. He understood that his mother had died believing her son had abandoned her for American success, never knowing that he had stayed away specifically to protect her from consequences of his compromised situation. Most painfully, he understood that his promise to return rich in 2 years had been fulfilled in the cruelest possible way. He had indeed become rich, but that wealth had cost him everything that made wealth worthwhile, including the ability to ever return to the person he had promised to help. The story of Carlos Mendoza is ultimately about how single moments can determine entire lives, and about how survival sometimes requires accepting permanent exile from everything that gives survival meaning. It is about the invisible networks of crime that exploit vulnerable immigrants by offering them choices that are not really choices at all, then using those forced decisions to bind people permanently to organizations they never intended to join. It is about how wealth accumulated through compromised means becomes worthless because it cannot purchase the things that actually matter: time with loved ones, peace of mind, freedom from guilt and fear, ability to live authentically rather than behind protective lies. It is about the special cruelty of situations where protecting people you love requires staying away from them, where the proof of devotion is permanent absence rather than presence. Most fundamentally, it is about promises that are technically kept but completely broken, about returning rich but never being able to return at all, and about discovering that some doors close behind you with such finality that no amount of money can ever reopen them, leaving you permanently locked out of the only place you ever truly wanted to be. Carlos Mendoza still lives in Houston as of this writing, still working for the same organization that has controlled his life for over 30 years, still accumulating wealth he cannot meaningfully use, still existing in a permanent exile that is both physical and emotional. He has never returned to Sinaloa since that optimistic departure in 1989, and he will never return because the reasons that made return impossible have only intensified over the decades. The house he never built for his mother stands as a metaphor in his mind for all the promises that wealth could not fulfill, for all the damage that money cannot repair, for all the losses that cannot be recovered regardless of how rich you become. He is rich beyond anything he imagined when he made his promise, and he is poor in every way that matters. Permanently separated from home not by distance or borders, but by choices whose consequences proved irreversible and permanent. He promised his mother he would return rich in 2 years, and he discovered instead that some prices are too high to pay, regardless of what you gain, and that returning home was something he could never do, not because he lacked money, but because the money he acquired had cost him the ability to go back to the only place that had ever been home.